Now I'm pretty much a full-time jazz musician. I run a group called Earthworks, which is primarily a British outfit. We feel we have a specific slant on jazz, which might be of interest to you guys who kind of invented the art form. And I'm over here promoting a record, which is actually this band's 9th CD, as I think a 9th CD. And life goes on, and we aim to improve as musicians, and it's an endless and fascinating game, the art of being a musician. Don't forget, I was very fortunate as a baby when I started that a lot of bills got paid quite quickly. So I don't really have to pay the bills in quite that desperate sense. I'm not a high spender, so the money I earned as a kid, gets invested and it gets used to support other aspects of the arts. A bit like you were a movie star, and you do a Hollywood movie once in a while, and then you, for way too much money, then you go back across the pond back to England, you play with the Royal Shakespeare Company for way too little money. And the big money supports the little money, and that's how you progress as an artist if you feel so inclined. Well, I'm a kind of phlegmatic guy. I'm not very interested in show business, per se. I'm not terribly interested in fame or celebrity or any of that stuff very much. In fact, it can be extremely difficult, and it gets in the way, or it can get in the way of what it is that you thought you were trying to do in the first place. They always say, one of the hardest things to survive, or the first hardest thing to survive in popular music culture is success, and the second hardest thing is failure. Well, put it the other way around. The first thing that's difficult to survive is failure, and then the next big problem is success. How do you survive that and still keep going, So you sort of need to know what it is you want to hear, and that's usually your mind telling you that, and you hear some music and you think that's what I ought to be doing. Well, of course, progressive rock hadn't been invented. We were at the tail end of what they called sort of British blues boom, or rhythm and blues, electric rhythm and blues, and all the bands that tended to come out of England in the late 60s really had started 2 or 3 years earlier as rhythm and blues groups. Pink Floyd, is taken from the name of Pink somebody or other, Pink Anderson? Mm-hmm. Floyd Anderson and Pink somebody or other. Anyway, 2 rhythm and blues characters of the day. And the Savoy Brown Blues Band, and we were all kind of blues guys. Then, to cut a very long story short, as my understanding is, on the whole, this very happy scene got infiltrated by British art school students. Now, the British have a strange system, and quite a healthy system of art schools, or they did, where a lot of students were studying art of one sort or another. But with that came, of course, fashion and music and developments in art one way or another. And these guys typically were more middle class, typically white, typically better educated than your average working class blues musician. And once they'd heard the 3 chords, these guys, they kind of wanted to hear a 4th chord and a 5th chord, and they wondered what it would be like if you added a diminished chord, or what would it be like if you added an organ to this, or an orchestra to it. And so they kind of polluted this nice, simple rhythm and blues format by bringing in aspects of the art world, including visual arts, and of course stage arts and performance arts and clothing and all sorts of other things. And it turned into a kind of a more full-blown and a more complete art endeavor, as it were, with other aspects of the arts molded into it. And then somebody came along and said, well, this sounds like progressive rock. I thought it was the duty and function and obligation of any musician to be progressive. I didn't realize there was anything else that you could do or would want to do until I met country music, which was a kind of sort of standing in the water kind of music. And I didn't understand that. I thought the idea was that what you did one day, month, year, you did differently the next year. You brought new things to it, and I just assumed we would be progressive. I did not see them in Hyde Park with the Stones, but a couple of days later I must have seen them. And we were around, this all hinged around a club in London called the Speakeasy. And Yes's manager, called Roy Flynn, managed the Speakeasy. The great thing about that was you could drive 200 miles back after your show and get a great free steak sandwich and vodka and Coke, which is what everybody used to drink for some reason. Sounds awful, doesn't it? And rum and Coke. And you could get all this free back at the Speakeasy at 2 a.m. if you got on with it. So there were a lot of musicians that came through town, Jimi Hendrix among others, and the guys from his group, and it was just a small club. And I remember hearing King Crimson for the first time there, and it really was astonishing what a shock that particular group had on the assembled population of people in the club. Discipline, control, all the good things you'd want with music. They just seemed to know what they were doing. This wasn't kind of cigarettes burning away and the end of the guitar jammed in there and a pint of beer on top of the amplifier and people shambling on stage and trying to get the microphone to work. These guys turned up on stage, were absolutely silent, as if, wait for it, horror of horrors, they knew that their instruments would work. They made no noise whatsoever, and then suddenly, without any apparent sound at all hell broke loose. In a very controlled, kind of passionate but controlled sort of fury, which was really amazing. Clearly these people could play their instruments too. They obviously had jazz ability, and it was a shock. They were a great group. On the whole, this was not a jamming scene like a jazz scene would be, where musicians just turned up and played kind of bass alongside King Crimson. These were, sort of formed units, and you slit your wrists and mingled blood, and you were forever in Led Zeppelin, or you were forever in Pink Floyd. And the idea that the drummer from Led Zeppelin would sit in, man, with Pink Floyd didn't work, because he wouldn't have known the tune. And anyway, that would have been like the striker from Arsenal joining Leeds suddenly for a game of football. That wouldn't have worked. You were in a team together, and they did get quite competitive. But bear in mind, the music industry was trebling per annum in size and in income. So everybody had a recording contract, and everybody had a van, and everybody went up and down the highway system, the new highway system, doing gigs. So this was easy. I don't even remember signing a recording contract, let alone having to get one. It was just there. I probably put my name on the bottom. Next day we were in the studio. Yes, and particularly in Yes, there was a culture of finding the better guy. So as soon as you could see that there was a better guy in another band, you made him an offer you couldn't refuse. Or if your keyboard player wasn't quite up to scratch and there was a long, tall, attractive-looking guy in a kind of jumpsuit, called Rick Wakeman, then you might poach Rick Wakeman, as we say, and make him an offer, and he'd join your band. And then you were assembling star players, a lot like a football team would. Soccer team, sorry. Yes, but be careful. King Crimson in 1968-9 was a much bigger group than Yes was. King Crimson had an immediate and huge smash record called In the Court of the Crimson King, which astonished everybody and was an immediate hit. And they played with the Rolling Stones in Hyde Park and everything. Yes, meanwhile, had a ton of promise and was signed to Atlantic Records along with Led Zeppelin very early on, and these were going to be the two big cheese groups. Led Zeppelin took off like wildfire, and Yes did absolutely nothing and went backwards in the water. Now, these days, Yes would have been terminated, should I say let go, perhaps, after about 6 minutes, let alone 6 months. Now, Yes actually had 3 albums in 3 years of patience from a long-sided record company, which is, of course, in a slower world, they could do that. But even so, right up to the 3rd album, there was a lot of problem. We were down to our last $50. We thought we were pretty much dead in the water. That's true. So we had 3 albums. Then things went right suddenly for a variety of reasons, which we won't go into now. Things suddenly got incredibly right, and the next thing I know, I'm sitting in a limousine outside JFK, and somebody's giving me Billboard, and Yes' record Fragile is number 4, and in America, which is a country I've only just discovered, as it were. And, on top was Carole King's Tapestry, as I recall, and maybe a Frank Sinatra record or something. And so we seemed like we were doing the right thing suddenly, and we couldn't quite figure out how that had happened. I had a couple of albums of that, and then I think I'd probably done the best I could. And I thought I wasn't about to repeat myself by going round close to the edge again, which had taken forever and a day to do, and caused some sleepless nights. The particular song, that particular song was real nice and stately and had space in it, a lot of space. But more important, for me, I was hooked more on the faster stuff like 21st Century Schizoid Man, which was groundbreaking tune as far as I was concerned. The slower material, and I don't remember the other cuts on the album actually, but the slow material, but that particular tune is a beauty. I think is really beautiful. And I don't think the lyrics are silly at all. I think that stuff was very clever, and I thought the idea that you had a band called King Crimson who might live this mythical guy with the red beard, sometimes known as the devil and so forth, who lived in a crimson court or something. I thought all this was great mythological stuff, and it didn't bother me at all. He's Robert Fripp, very interesting man, a very intelligent, very acute mind. Not a great musician, and be the first to acknowledge that. He's somebody who, and again, I'm quoting him actually, is somebody who has learned guitar a little bit like you learn French, in a rather stiff and rather awkward way. You don't go to him for the pure music that's coming out. It's more his guitar is a kind of conduit down which, and the group is a kind of conduit down which a number of very interesting ideas about what you can do with guitars, what you can do on a stage, what rock music may be in the future, how it might be in 10 years' time. Those kind of things, those kind of very interesting ideas can be brought to fruition. So as a motivator of musicians, a little like Miles Davis, terrific. A very astute band leader. It sounds simple, but part of the art of band leading is getting some interesting guys and locking them into a room and then getting out of the way. Because that's how you're going to get an interesting album. There might be blood on the floor and there'll definitely be some tears. But that's quite a good way to make records, and I kind of observed this. So he is quite manipulative, and he likes it to go in a certain way so that these things might occur. He's a very well-read man, and came to me at a time in my life when I was in search of somebody who could provide that kind of environment for me to play my drums in. So I was very happy in King Crimson. King Crimson and Yes used to flip-flop headline, American dates, and we'd often be on tour together. Sometimes Yes would be headlining, sometimes Crimson would. And I let it be known to Robert that I'd really rather play in King Crimson than Yes. I kind of liked the noise that the band made a bit better, and I thought maybe I could develop more as a drummer there. Because I wouldn't know what was going to happen in King Crimson. I knew very well what was going to happen in Yes. And I said to Robert, well, I think it's about time I'd sort of... I'd really like to join King Crimson. And he said, well, I think you're about ready now. And now that, of course, to some people is insufferably patronizing, and that's okay, and he was right. You have to learn to stand back a bit and to begin to realize that you don't know as much as you think you know. The problem with 18-year-old male drummers that get some early success is they're pretty damn sure they know everything there is to know. And
you didn't have that confidence, you wouldn't have been able to...
And only when you begin to realize that you don't know very much at all would it have been worth joining King Crimson. Yeah, I think he was quite smart to stop it in 74, right in front of the punk thing of 76, and then reinvent it when that particular storm had moved on in about 1980, which is very astute thinking. He saw that coming. I thought that was fine. I mean, the mere fact that it would never play again, ever, I don't listen to all that stuff, I mean, Robert had a number of philosophies and of one sort or another involving inclines to 1984 and the death of this or something of that. And a certain amount of that washed past me, because I was too... wisely, and I was too busy playing the drums, The question is often asked, well, so how did you feel if you'd, given up this golden goose, Yes, for this guy who, first of all, is insufferably patronizing and secondly, breaks up the group about 2 years later? And I didn't seem to mind at all. I have a fairly thick skin and confidence in my own ability. And I thought, well, that's pretty interesting. Now I'm ejected into the world on my own with neither Yes nor King Crimson. So that'll be a ride. And this is how the music industry goes. First time this kind of music really had been born on the planet, as far as I can make out. That is a high, dark, intense electric sound with clearly skilled musicians. And the tune was really an evergreen. We are, of course, now in the 21st century, and we're pretty schizoid. So on the whole, I think that was a fairly prophetic piece of music. One of the tracks that, for me, was seminal as a drummer, actually. This has a lot to do with drumming. On this one, and it's called One More Red Nightmare, you're going to hear a very funny, trashy cymbal. Shall I tell the cymbal story, Kath? What do you think? The previous band had just left the rehearsal room, and isn't it silly how they throw away into the trash can the best possible sounding cymbal you could ever have? Why? It was busted. No problem about that. I like sounds like that. On this particular cut, you'll hear this cymbal featured. Everybody in the band liked it so much they left space for this very cymbal to be heard. This is a drumistic kind of tune, but also has great lyrics from John Wetton, I think, and Richard Palmer James, bass playing also, and Robert Fripp on guitar. I was an unemployed musician in London, like you are, like you were, like some have been, even. And the traditional method was that there was a music paper called A Melody Maker, in which advertisements were placed and people answered them. But you needed to get there pretty early in the morning, like 9 a.m. I live North London, so 7 a.m. sharp I get up in order to find this newspaper on the streets Wednesday morning first thing at about 8:30. By 9 o'clock you need that phone call to be made, as it were. And at the other end, either John Anderson of Yes answered my ad or I answered his. I can't remember, but we hooked up anyway that particular morning. Met in a bar, a well-known place in Soho called La Chasse Club. And there was John Anderson and Chris Squire. And one or other of them had a very cool mini car. I don't know whether you know what a mini is, a very small car. Orange in flavor with blacked windows, for heaven's sake. Well, that's it. I'm ready now. So I thought that was all we needed to do, really. They took one look at me and thought, I don't know quite what they thought of me, but they said, did I have a Ludwig drum kit, which was the famous one of the day because Ringo Starr had one. So I said yes to that. The first rule of all interviews, of course, as you know, is you say yes to everything. So I said yes to that, and we agreed to play that night, as I recall it, at Rachel Macmillan's College in Deptford, East London, where we played the longest version ever known of In the Midnight Hour by Wilson Pickett, which is about the only tune we knew, I think. We sat around for days in a rehearsal room trying to knock music together, because we were a cover band. We just thought all we'd do is we'd make fancy arrangements of cover tunes, which we did from The Fifth Dimension, which is an American vocal group, and Vanilla Fudge, for heaven's sake, and all sorts of things. And we did fancy, long-winded arrangements of those things. But I think it was Peter Banks who said, let's call it Yes. Because all of the band's names were incredibly stupid at the time, like The Who. Now, I mean, what kind of an idiotic name is that? But it became very famous. Or The Nice. So, Yes seemed like the most positive word anybody could think of. It is quite extraordinary. I was telling the young guys in my band as we drove down from Boston last night about a couple of these things, and I realized with horror, this sounded to them like ancient history, not even modern history. It sounded like ancient history, and it was absolutely incredible as I was describing, tape editing and all the rest of the things that went on. But yes, it was very difficult because all five of these prima donnas all were pretty certain they knew how the music should go. But there was a fundamental communication problem too. And it's a little hard to describe in American terms, but we were all from very different British backgrounds. We had essentially an Accrington milkman, a guy who did a milk delivery round in northwest England. An academy-trained Rick Wakeman, who was a southern boy, a chorister, Chris Squire, who was a well-educated public school boy, myself also from a classic middle-class professional background. And there's a real problem here in that we physically cannot understand each other's accents. I mean, it's that difficult. The language is very difficult. Now, John Anderson has a terrific amount of music inside him and has always had a heck of a problem expressing it. He doesn't write music, he doesn't read music, and he doesn't speak well. Now, this is going to be difficult. I've just given you the three standard ways that music is imparted from musician A to musician B. If you don't use those three, you're going to end up shouting a lot. So he ruled the roost by default. So he'd be the first person to play something. And everybody else would say, John, that is god-awful. Can I say that on your radio station? John, that is really unacceptable. So at which point, the obvious reply is, so you do something better. Right? So reluctantly, the guitar player says, well, I suppose we could take that and we could add this. So it's a classic provocative kind of thing. If you don't like it, play something better or leave the group. This is the kind of way that would be on a good day. So that's how we would operate. And it was pretty brutal, and everybody pushed and shoved in a horrible kind of muscular way. But somehow we got there, and nobody knows how. There certainly wasn't any kind of a master plan. The construction of Close to the Edge was like trying to build, the World Trade Center again without a plan. One guy knows that it should go up 5 stories, or you're writing a novel with 5 guys. Another analogy, one guy knows the middle, one guy's got a great plot, the third guy is certain about the ending but hates the middle that you've suggested, and it's a mayhem. And you could only do this because somebody was paying their recording studio bills. Now, there's an old adage which says you get the music you pay for, which is very true. Music's completely dominated by finance. And in a world where there is a ton of money, you're going to get a lot of guys sitting around forever discussing music and coming up with weird things like that. Now it's much more disciplined because it has to be. It was a bit of a surprise, I think, on the whole, to demographers, that the people who seemed to take British progressive rock most to their hearts were kind of Midwestern guys, blue-collar, white-collar Midwestern guys. You know, I mean, it was Ohio and so forth. It was where, you know, people really got into this. Much of the fan base was Midwestern from the British point of view, and that's where a lot of the record sales were happening. Akron, Ohio, you know. And this always seems a bit of Philadelphia classically. And that always seemed slightly surprising. As to why your kids, I don't quite know why they found it, but bear in mind there's a huge parts of the record buying public that have nothing to do with progressive rock and wouldn't know what it was even if it hit them in the face, I think. Beautiful tune, I think, and a lovely shape to it. It's the form of this I really like a lot. Drama, tension, weird lyrics, but a beautiful phrase, Heart of the Sunrise, actually. It's something that I'm often asked about is, what is John Anderson talking about in those words? That never actually bothered me. Sometimes the sound of the words themselves are more important than their literal meaning. The band leader, John Anderson, was always very keen that the other guys in the band should try to contribute to writing the music. And in fact, in his world, you weren't really a real musician until you composed some music. So there was I, sweating over my piano, perspiring, nervous, worried that my little efforts wouldn't get accepted. And they were. One of my favorite tracks was Perpetual Change from the album, the Yes album, as I recall. And I particularly like this in part because of the title, which not only describes very accurately what's going on in the music, which was a perpetual change, not only the state of the band's career, the state of the career of Yes, which was always, it seemed, in permanent flux, in permanent change, but isn't that the way of all aspects of life? It's all perpetual change. I'd been working with this young whippersnapper of a drummer called Phil Collins. Now, Phil I'd met when he first was a road drum tech for me. He set up my drums in various gigs around England a little bit when he had time away from the band that he was in. And I can't remember what they were called, Flaming Youth, perhaps. And he was clearly a good drummer, and he wanted to study my style a bit and enjoyed hanging out, which was great. And then subsequently he formed a group called Brand X, which was kind of on a jazz fusion level in the early 70s, and I played some percussion in that. One day he turns to me and says, "We've got a problem here. This guy, Peter Gabriel, you know him in Genesis, he's leaving the band." And that's not the main problem. The main problem is that I, Phil, have been auditioning for other singers, and we've had 101 people in, and they're all terrible. And I can do it better than they. And I said, "Phil, why don't you go ahead and do that? I'll play drums in Genesis for a year or so till you're on your feet, because you'll be pretty certain that the music won't fall apart behind you," which of course would be his nightmare being a drummer, that somehow you're stuck out front, and the music falls apart behind you, elegantly, but nevertheless falls apart. That would be a nightmare, wouldn't it? And that's what we agreed to do. So he stood up front and sounded immediately and remarkably like Peter Gabriel in the first opening months. Everybody was astonished at how well he did it. The band, I'm happy to tell you, didn't fall apart. And sure enough, after about 9 months, I felt I'd done my bit and moved on. I think one of the interesting aspects about Phil that you don't hear a lot about is his extraordinary ability to mimic. He's a brilliant mimic. If you were sitting here right now and you heard the sound of a sea lion, it would be an entirely authentic sea lion. It would be Phil entering the room, aping the sound, copying the sound brilliantly of a sea lion. His ability to get up as an actor and act Peter Gabriel was remarkable. He then learnt also to act drumming like Billy Cobham, now on a seriously high level. It was never quite Phil. He's essentially an actor, and all that broken voice stuff and those tortuous ballads he became very famous for, all that was very, very skillful, but I sensed it was acting rather than actually him, until maybe Face Value, which was his big hit opening. Drum styles, now there's an interesting kettle of fish. How do I describe my own style? Well, pretty oblique, really. I tend to place the beat in a rather unusual place. People say to me a lot, I really like your snare drum sound. And often I think what they mean is that they really like where I played the snare drum in the rhythm. It tends to pop out in rather unusual places, and people hear it as being in a rather syncopated way, not like your standard 2 and 4, as what we call sort of meat and potatoes, grave digging drumming, as we might call it. And I got some of that from early jazz drummers and some of the unusual placements that jazz musicians have, but also from a great British drummer called Ainsley Dunbar, whose name you might know. He emigrated from the UK to California and joined Frank Zappa, and then went on to Journey and Jefferson Starplane. And then went on to Jefferson Starship. Ainsley had a lovely jazzy style, very loose, and placed the beat in an unusual place too. So Ainsley would be very important. Also, I was really impressed by the early Mike Giles, who played on this very seminal King Crimson CD in the album called In the Court of the Crimson King. Mike had terrific poise and authority. It's quite difficult at fast tempos to be elegant and unhurried. The trick to fast tempos is to play them as if you're in no hurry at all, even though you might be in a state of advanced panic. And somehow there was plenty of daylight between Mike Giles's notes, so there was no sense of hurry or disturbance at all. So Mike was a very big influence. He didn't develop a career as much. He was an early star that burnt out rather quickly, and was unable to parlay that initial and enormous talent into a 36-year career, which lesser mortals like myself have managed to somehow do. So I would cite Ainsley Dunbar certainly as being an interesting influence, and also Mike Giles.